Starting with you, Julian Simmonds, a lot of plans announced today. New South Wales, obviously the big state leading the way. What have you made of what they've outlined, making unvaccinated people waiting till December 1, but they do get all of their freedoms as of that date, depending on what individual stores do, of course, cafes and so on. Do you think there's still enough incentive to get our vaccination rates right up there?
Well, I think there is. There's certainly incentive when premiers outline to people in their state the freedoms that they can enjoy and how they're going to get back to normal if they are vaccinated. And I think that's what Gladys has done. It's a good example that other premiers can now follow, because there'll be an opportunity for the state to reopen a little bit, for the health system to readjust, and then for those freedoms to be further extended. But, it's in contrast, for example, with my home state in Queensland, where there isn't as much incentive to be vaccinated, I don't think, because the Premier is refusing to provide any certainty about if we do reach the milestones that we will get those freedoms returned to us.
We'll get to that in a moment. Julian Hill, though, your reaction to the various roadmaps today?
Look, anything that enables people to start reclaiming some of their freedom and get life back, something closer to normal, is welcome. But we have to do it safely, and that's the key point. I'm not going to go into the detail of state by state. All the states and territories are in different places, and Australians have had different experiences of the pandemic. The common factor, though, in moving towards the national plan adopted by National Cabinet, which we all support, is the lack of vaccines and how quickly we can get supply on. And that's Scott Morrison's fault. There has not been enough supply. We're still near last in the world. And in my home state of Victoria, I've got a vaccination hub about 200 metres from my office here. They still often run out of vaccinations at 2 or 3 p.m. every day because the community demand is so strong. Now, Victorians are looking at our brothers, sisters, cousins, friends, family in Sydney. We'll learn from that, but we're also furious that we're sitting so far behind New South Wales because Scott Morrison diverted our Pfizer to New South Wales. So we're on track, having suffered the longest lockdowns, to be 2, 3, 4 weeks behind where Sydney is. That's just not acceptable.
All right. Let me ask about Queensland, Julian Simmonds. So the big criticism has been around we might keep borders up till Christmas. We don't actually have anything in the national roadmap, the plan out at the moment, specific on borders. So what do you think the federal government should be pushing to include on that?
Well, look, I worry about a situation where you'll be able to go overseas from New South Wales or Victoria before you can get up to see your close family in Queensland. And I think that would be, a terrible situation to find ourselves in Queensland as a state. Again, this is power around the borders that the premiers have always have and they've always wielded. And it isn't a deal that the Queensland Premier has made with the Australian government. It's a deal she's made with Queenslanders that, hey, the incentive is to come out and get vaccinated because this is our road back to normalcy. And all the data is that once you reach 80%, you should be able to achieve that. And she's unable to provide that certainty.
Well, just on that, though, when you say all the data...
she's very dismissive and disrespectful about it too, right?
There's different data around the world as to what happens. Isn't it fair enough to see what happens in New South Wales when there's a full reopening at 80% and what that does to the hospital system before locking that in Queensland? You can sit there and watch what happens in New South Wales and then move from there.
I'd back our Doherty Institute modelling as the best in the world any day of the week. And as you said, if you can outline that roadmap to Australians for freedom, then they'll get an incentive to vaccinate. I mean, look, I didn't get into politics.
I'm all for the incentive to restrict
there's
modelling,
people's freedoms constantly, right? But this seems to be where
even the modellers will say. Even the modellers will say this won't be exactly right. You're about to get a real-life example in New South Wales. It's a couple of weeks away.
Yeah, but, we shouldn't restrict people's freedoms any longer than they have to. Now, I didn't get into politics to do that. I've had to explain to people why, for very good reasons, during the pandemic. They can't have more than 10 people at a funeral. But it's hard, and you get to the point of 80% when the modelling says that you should open up, and you've still got the Queensland Premier trying to justify why, trying to tell people that they shouldn't be able to travel interstate to see their friends, they shouldn't be able to see family, they shouldn't be able to bring a son or daughter back from interstate or overseas, despite the fact that we're at 80%. Okay. And I think the Queensland Premier should provide that certainty. That's what Queenslanders are looking for.
Okay. Julian Hill, just on the 80% double vax, it was always that sort of mark where we thought we'd get most of our freedoms back. Should it be the default that interstate borders are open then? And if it's not the case, then the Chief Health Officer or the Premier can explain it. But the default would be, yes, we'll be open, barring something else, barring a hospital system in trouble or whatever it might be?
Well, we wouldn't be having the border closures and we wouldn't be having the lockdown still if the federal government had enough vaccines. That's the first point. But we're back in the national plan. If there's inconsistencies or different interpretations of the national plan, there's different state leaders, Labor and Liberal. I notice Julian likes to attack the Queensland Premier. I'm not going to criticise any political leader, any state or territory political leader, whether that's the Tasmanian Premier or the Queensland Premier or the WA Premier or the South Australian Premier, for wanting to keep their community safe and wanting to keep this deadly disease out. I saw the Tasmanian Premier said, well, his interpretation of the national plan is that he wants to give everyone in Tasmania a chance to have a vaccination and protect themselves from this deadly disease when they finally get the supply. That's not an unreasonable position. Now, if there's different interpretations, then the Prime Minister needs to actually lead instead of hiding and convene the National Cabinet.
We're nearly out of time, but when you say you're not going to criticise any leader, what, they're beyond any sort of criticism no matter what they do exiting this pandemic? That just sounds like sort of blindly saying they're doing a good job no matter what.
No, my point is we're all heading in the same direction. No one wants the borders closed any longer than they need to be. No one wants lockdowns.
WA might be shut longer
no
because
one wants
the hospital
lockdowns.
system can't cope.
The Queensland Premier
That's a uniquely WA issue, presumably, Julian Hill.
No, but the Queensland Premier, I've heard them say, of course they want tourists to return. Of course they want the borders to be open. I mean, it's just nonsense to say that's not the case. But there are judgments that have to be made, and each state and territory, as part of the national plan, this is not freelancing, as part of the national plan, each state and territory are going to determine their own course out of these damaging lockdowns. We should never have been in this mess. We should never have been in this mess as a country. The country should have been open last Christmas when the Prime Minister said it would be. Australians should have returned home. The economy was going to snap back. This was all going to happen last Christmas. 9 or 10 months on, we're still arguing about what's going to happen in October and November to get out of the mess that the Prime Minister created.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure we could have all been vaccinated by then. I know Labor makes points about hotel quarantine, but look, we're right out of time.